In this video, I'm going to go through the main differences that you can expect between cheap versus expensive binoculars, both in terms of the build quality, materials and components used, as well as the quality of the view that you can expect when looking through them. And we're going to start right now. Hello and welcome to Best Binocular Reviews. My name is Jason. Continuing on with my mini Bino War series, in which I pitch different types of binoculars against each other, today's video comes as a result of a question sent in to me, the answer to which I thought would be well worth sharing. The question goes as follows. I'm a novice looking to buy a good pair of binoculars. The problem is I don't know what my budget should be. So please can you explain to me what the difference is between a cheap pair of binoculars and an expensive pair, and how this affects the way they work. On the BBR website, I divide the binos that I review into 6 main price categories, ranging from very cheap binoculars costing less than $50 or £50, right up to the very best premium binoculars that have a price tag of more than $1,200 or pounds. To the average person, most binoculars, regardless of whether they are cheap or expensive, look essentially the same. I mean, they both have similar looking bodies, they both have large objective lenses, and they both have eye cups that you rest your eyes against. So it can be hard to understand why some cost so much more than others. So in this video, I'm going to point out the major differences between them, just to show you where the extra money goes, and thus hopefully help you decide what your particular budget should be. Now, as you would expect, very cheap binoculars are manufactured in such a way and in locations where production costs are kept to an absolute minimum. Labor is cheap, there is as much automation as possible, and they often buy in many generic parts in bulk from third parties. I have a table on the BBR website that lists most of these and contrasts them against what you can expect on more expensive instruments, and I recommend you take a look at it. But to give you some examples, very cheap binoculars will almost always have a plastic chassis and use many plastic body parts and components. This will include the focus wheel, the eye cups and the eyepiece housings. As well as being less robust and thus more likely to break if you're to drop your instrument, the actual function of their mechanisms is usually inferior. Now, if we take a look at these 2 examples of cheap binoculars that I have here with me, both of them feel extremely lightweight, especially when you compare them to a high-end instrument like these that has the same configuration. Now, what this indicates to me is that both of them contain far more plastic parts and components, and this includes the chassis underneath the actual rubber armor itself. In sharp contrast to this, more expensive binoculars will actually have a metal body hiding underneath the rubber armor, which I hope you can clearly see in this cutaway example. So taking a close look at the focus wheels on these 2 cheap binoculars, I can instantly see that they are very generic and obviously made in huge quantities and used on many binoculars from many different brands at this price range. Then what you'll also often find is the actual rubber cover doesn't fit very well and comes away quite easily. On top of this, you will notice that underneath this, the actual housing of the focus wheel is made out of plastic. Now here I'm lucky in that both of these examples are actually pretty decent for this price range. However, it's quite common for cheap binoculars to have a lot of free play or to have a lot of rough points within the focus mechanism itself. Now, taking a look at the eyepieces and the eye cups on these cheap binoculars, you'll once again notice that the actual housing themselves are made out of plastic. And on top of this, the mechanism itself is not quite as smooth as it should be. And it's quite a lot of free play. If you look at the actual eye cup itself, moves around quite a bit. Then lastly, as I move the cup up and down searching for the fixed click stop, you'll notice it doesn't sort of lock into these quite as securely or as obviously as it should do. Also worth noting is that many cheap binoculars, whilst advertised as being weather protected or water resistant, this doesn't mean that they are fully sealed, and thus they aren't completely waterproof. Now, for those of you who don't go out in the wet and that, this may not seem like a great deal, but remember, these seals also protect the binocular from tiny particles like dust from getting inside the system. On top of this, because they're not fully sealed, they obviously don't contain the dry argon or nitrogen gas within the chassis themselves, which can protect the internal lens elements from fogging up. On the other end of the scale, higher spec, more expensive optics are built to much higher, more exacting standards by more highly skilled technicians using the latest technologies and using only the finest quality materials and components. So gone are the plastic chassis, focus wheels and eyepieces. Instead, a good quality expensive binocular will have a magnesium chassis and all metal components. There is no doubt that they are more robust, But on top of this, the actual workings of the things like the focusing and twist-up eyepiece mechanisms just simply work better. They are smoother, without any free play or stiff points, and thus it's just easier to be more precise when using them. Taking a look at these three examples of high-end, more expensive binoculars, the first thing to note is that all three use a magnesium chassis. And thus, whilst they may be quite a lot heavier than the equivalent cheap binocular, the advantages is definitely they just feel more robust and just like a better quality instrument when you hold them in your hands. The housings for the eyepieces and the eye cups are made from metal. And as you can see, even though I'm trying to move these about quite firmly, there's almost no free play or movement. As well as this, the cups click very positively into each of the click stops. And even though I'm pushing quite firmly down on the eye cups of these GPO binoculars, they will not move, which means they will remain at the setting you desire. On some more expensive binoculars, like these Mavens, you can actually unscrew the cups and remove them. This means they can be replaced, but on top of that, it also makes cleaning the actual ocular lenses that much easier. The focus wheels on all three of these binoculars are substantially different from each other, and by no means generic. As well as this, the focusing mechanism on all three is extremely smooth, and if you take a closer look at this Maven, you'll see that it's entirely made from metal, so not only does it work well, but it looks great as well. As well as this, a lot of more expensive, higher end binoculars have a lot of little features and touches that you just simply don't find on cheaper instruments. So for example, these binoculars have lockable diopters. So once you've made your setting, you can lock them into place and you can be sure that it will not actually move out of position. Going one step even further, you'll notice that with these GPO Passion HD binoculars, they've incorporated the diopter adjuster into the actual focus wheel itself. And thus, once you have calibrated the binocular to your particular eyesight and locked in your setting, it is completely hidden and out of the way. In terms of the optics, the glass that low-cost binoculars use for the lenses and prisms are of a lesser quality and as such has a higher bubble count and more imperfections than that of a higher quality and more expensive optical glass used on the more expensive binoculars. As well as this, the glass they use will have very few and sometimes if any of the special optical coatings that are used on higher end instruments. These different coatings are extremely important and help in many ways to improve the view by doing things like increasing light transmission and decreasing distortions and aberrations. As well as this, more expensive binoculars will add special coatings to the outer lens surfaces. These hardened layers protect the lenses from scratching, as well as inhibiting water and oil from sticking onto the glass and thus marking it. You will also notice that even though all four of these binoculars have a very similar 8 or 10 by 42 configuration, the two expensive binoculars have much larger ocular lenses than the cheap binoculars. Now there are numerous advantages to this, but they're just a little bit too technical to go into in this video, but I'll link to it down in the description below. But in terms of a usability point of view, larger ocular lenses make it much easier for you to line up your eyes with them, and thus it's much easier to use the binocular because looking through them you have much less chance of having black rings forming around the edges of the view. As well as all this, on a recent visit to the Steiner factory in Germany, where they produce higher-end, generally more expensive binoculars, something that really struck me was just how many steps there are in the process of making one of their pairs of optics, and just how much work goes into every single one of those steps. The exacting attention to every single detail and the number of quality checks that every single Steiner binocular went through from start to finish really blew me away. From polishers to ovens, grinders to pressure chambers, and a whole host of equipment for testing the instruments, there was a lot of very specialist and very impressive looking machinery. But at the same time, this was by no means an automated factory. At every step, there were highly skilled people working on and checking the binoculars and the optics, many of whom I found out later had been working for Steiner for many years, and in some cases for a couple of generations. At this point, it became obvious to me that all of the specialist equipment, quality materials, and highly skilled labor does not come cheap, and therefore, their instruments are never going to be able to compete in terms of price against the mass-produced binoculars made from inferior materials and in parts of the world where labor is much cheaper. But what you can be sure of is that you're receiving a precision instrument of a very high quality. One of the more obvious differences between low-cost and cheap binoculars versus expensive and even mid to high-level instruments is in the quality of the extras and included accessories. Cheap binoculars often arrive on my desk in simple boxes without any sort of branding or indication of the exact model or configuration of binocular contained within them. These generic mass-produced boxes are used by many companies selling cheap binoculars. High-end and expensive binoculars, on the other hand, often come with much more elaborate packaging that not only offers the instrument much more protection, but also acts as a display case for it. A good example is that used by these Maven B12 11x45 binoculars. Low-cost and cheap binoculars either don't have any, or their lens covers are unmarked, very generic, and used on many instruments from a host of different brands. The soft plastic that they are made from is also much more lightweight and can break quite easily, especially at the weak areas, like the crease where the cups actually join onto the tether ring that goes around the barrels. In sharp contrast to this, the lens covers on high-end instruments are often specifically designed for this particular brand and indeed the specific configuration of binocular. As such, they often contain the logo of the brand, fit into the ends of the barrels instead of over them, and in general just look much more part of the instrument instead of just being an afterthought. Because of this, they usually fit better and thus less likely to come away by accident. As well as all this, they are usually made from a thicker, much tougher soft rubber that is no doubt longer lasting and less likely to break at the weak points like the crease. One of the most obvious differences is between the neck straps supplied with cheap versus expensive binoculars. The generic, very lightweight, completely unpadded straps are no match for the individually branded, high quality, well padded neck straps that usually come with a high-end instrument. These high-end straps also often have a number of design features that set them apart even further. For example, as well as being much more thickly padded, they are slightly curved to better fit around your neck and shoulders. And then on the underside, they also have a more grippy surface. This prevents them from slipping from side to side as you walk. The connectors are usually far more robust and less likely to break, and they often have a quick release clip on each of the straps, making them much easier to take on and off and swap out, and thus allow you to attach the binocular more easily to something like a bino harness. An excellent example is the strap that comes with these GPO Passion HD binoculars. Once again, the average carry case that comes supplied with a cheap binocular is generic, unbranded, made from a very lightweight material and with very little or if any extra padding on the inside. As these cheap generic cases are not specifically made for the particular instrument, the binoculars also often don't fit very well inside and either just flop about or you have to twist down the eye cups to close the lid. On the other end of the spectrum, the best binoculars often have cases that are specifically designed for the particular brand and model of instrument, which results in a much better fit. So by this, I mean there's enough space to easily replace and take out the binocular, but snug enough so that they don't flop about inside. The cases themselves are also of a semi-rigid design and or have a lot of protective padding on the inside. You generally get extra pockets and an adjustable carry strap, and on top of this they just look better made using better materials. Once again, a really good example of these high-end cases is one that comes supplied with these GPO Passion HD binoculars. While by no means the norm, you also sometimes find extra accessories being included with more expensive instruments. So a really great example is the carry case that comes with these Vortex Razor UHD binoculars that doubles as a bino harness and comes with these straps included. As if this wasn't enough, you also get an extra accessory pouch designed to fit onto the front of the case, your belt, backpack, or indeed anywhere where you have webbing. So by now, I guess you're probably thinking that I'm totally against all cheap and low-cost binoculars, and that you should only consider buying an expensive pair. This is most certainly not the case, and whilst I generally suggest you stick away from the very cheapest pairs of binoculars on the market, I do believe that it's important to understand that they have their limitations, and thus when you do go out and buy yourself a pair, you do so based more on simply price alone. So there you have it. I do hope that this video has given you a much better understanding of why there is such a big price difference between the most expensive and the cheapest binoculars on the market. If this video has been of use and of interest to you, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to see more in the future, please do remember to subscribe, and if possible, hit that little bell button. These are things that really do help both myself and my channel to bring you more and more content in the future, and I really appreciate it. So having said all that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers for now.